Output caching allows you to store the output of a particular controller action in memory. ASP.NET then can respond to future requests for that same action just by giving back the cached output, and that avoids executing any of the code inside the action. Because you're executing less code and doing less work, caching can lead to some pretty dramatic performance gains, but you do have to be careful when using the cache to avoid erroneous responses. I'll show you such a scenario in our demo. Caching itself is easy to enable using the output cache action filter. You can cache actions that produce view results and JSON results, or really any type of data-oriented result, and primarily those results that are read-only and expensive to produce, like the result of executing an expensive database query and rendering the results in a view. That's where you would get your biggest win with the output cache attribute. The attribute will also work on child actions, as we'll see, and there's a variety of options you specify on the attribute itself, like the duration that the cache item should live in memory, that's specified in seconds, and what parameters should vary the cache, which is best understood using an example. Here we are at the home page of our application, where as a user I can search for restaurants that start with an M, or restaurants that have a Y, and you can see that this search form is working. If you've been following along with the course, then you'll remember that we made this search form very fancy with AJAX and jQuery templates, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I've removed all the AJAX fanciness to make the behavior of the output cache attribute very clear. When the user performs a search, the form on this page will submit a GET request back to the index action of the home controller, and the code will try to find restaurants with a matching name. This is a read-only operation and a perfect opportunity for caching if the search query is expensive. So let me go to the index action of the home controller and add an output cache attribute. I'm going to specify a duration of 60 seconds for the cache and specify vary by param equals none, which is very wrong, but I want to show you what happens when caching behavior does go wrong. And let's put a breakpoint inside of the index action and run this application with the debugger. And you can see this is the first time through the request where we are displaying the home page. And let me bring that up. There's the home page, and now let's search for restaurants with a Y. And you'll notice that the search request did go through to the web server. In fact, in the URL, you can see query string equals Y, Q equals Y. But you'll notice that in the debugger, we did not hit a breakpoint, and that's because ASP.NET took the previous response to this request and just returned it. And that previous request, there wasn't any search parameter involved, so we did not send back any restaurants for the view to render. Essentially, if there's no search term passed into us, we just pass to the view an empty collection of restaurants. And the problem here is that the cache really should be varied by a parameter. That is, for each distinct value of Q that arrives here, ASP.NET should cache a different copy of the output. When someone is searching for M, then that should be a cached result, and when someone is searching for Y, that should be a different cached result. So with that change in place, let me rebuild and run this with the debugger again, and what we'll see is that we end up inside of this method on the first request to the application. And now I should be able to search for restaurants with a Y, and you can see we come into the index action, and we display the appropriate restaurant. I can then search for restaurants with an M in the name. This will be a different parameter in the query string. Again, we're inside of the index action. That response is going to be cached, as was the previous request when we searched for restaurants with a Y. If I do that search, notice that response comes back, and we never hit the code inside of the index action of the home controller. ASP.NET can now serve up different versions of that output cache depending on what parameter was passed in. This is the correct behavior that we want, so you'll need to be very careful when you specify an output cache attribute to make sure you're varying the cache by any incoming parameters that might change what the response should look like. You can also apply the output cache attribute to a child action. We looked at using child actions earlier in the course. They are essentially a sub-request inside the primary MVC request that you set up using the HTML.action helper. Child actions are wonderful for caching because if you have a view that is mostly dynamic, and uncacheable, but there is a portion of the view that you can aggressively cache, then if you render that cacheable portion of the view using a child action, you can apply caching and improve performance. Let me demonstrate by coming into the index view, and what I want to do is add some output here so that we know exactly when this view renders. I'll just say that index rendered at datetime.now.toLong time string. That'll let us see how many minutes and seconds past the hour that this rendered. And then after this, what we'll do is use the html.action helper to render a child action. Since this example is a little bit contrived, I'll just name the action child action, and we'll put some markup inside of there to see when it renders. Now all we need is a child action inside of our home controller. So let's add something that returns a partial view result called child action. In this example, I'm not going to use any parameters, and we're just going to return the default view for this particular action. And before we leave here, we will of course put on an output cache attribute. I'll specify a duration of 10 seconds, which is shorter than the 60 seconds that the index action uses, and we'll see how that has some interesting effects. And we'll say vary by param equals none, and now all we need is the view itself. Let me right click in here and say add view, a view named child action. It is going to be a partial view, and the one bit of markup that we'll need inside of here will look just like it does in the index view. So let me copy this and paste it and say that child rendered at datetime.now.toLong time string. And now after a build, I can run the application, and notice how the index view and the child view, they rendered at the same time, at least for this first request. And now if I do a quick search for restaurants, notice how the index view had to re-render itself, but the child content is still showing a cached response. In this example, we didn't do any useful work inside the child action, but if there was an expensive database query there, we just saved ourselves a trip to the database, because the child action didn't have to execute. The MVC framework just injected the cached response at the appropriate point. But also notice this. If I go back to the default home page with no search parameters, we pick up the first cache response for the index action, and at this point the child cache entry should have expired. We only set the duration to 10 seconds, and I've been talking for more than 10 seconds. The way we have things set up though, the child action will not get a chance to execute because the parent index action is still cached. We set the duration there to 60 seconds, but we should see an update if I perform a new search. Now they both had to update. So using an output cache on a child action is an effective technique for caching portions of a view, but just be aware that what you see is also affected by any caching that you might have on a parent action.